Welcome. My name is Bob Tickleman. I'm a principal Microsoft technical trainer, and I'm excited to be your guide for learning path number 9, develop event-based solutions. This is part of a series of 2 different learning paths and 4 different modules across those 2 that get into a general concept called queues. We're going to start off and take a look at 2 types of queues called event-based queues, event grids and event hubs. This module is on exploring event grids. So before I jump into the content, I want to go through and make sure that you understand what this broader concept of a queue is, why I need it, and why there's a difference between event-based queues and message-based queues. When you take a look at modern application development, a term that we use is called decoupling. And I need to decouple 2 direct things. So for example, if I wanted to buy something and I was supposed to put it into a shopping cart and I needed to run something against my database to actually extract those values from the quantities of each of the products sold, you run into a potential problem with the items in your shopping cart and the more people. So if all of a sudden now I get millions of users putting hundreds of thousands of things into a shopping cart, I need a SQL database that is now going to have to scale to meet these requirements. Maybe I have to react to an activity that if someone uploads a file into a file storage, I need to do classification on that file. I need to create a thumbnail, and I need to have a whole bunch of other processing that goes through. So these are all activities that in my application design and development, I have to then go through and understand, what do I need to work with? And I run into a potential problem that in this example specifically, if my SQL Server cannot handle, thousands or hundreds of thousands of requests, it could cause the application to fail. So what I need to do is decouple the actual activity of purchasing something from deprecating that from the inventory and what's called order fulfillment. And so by doing that, I create a thing called a queue. Now, a queue in general is a way to provide decoupling, because now what I do is I put items into the queue, and as long as the queue can handle thousands or hundreds of thousands of things being put into it, I then decouple my front end, because everybody's put things in the queue, they go away. Then what I can start doing is I can start pulling out, maybe through an Azure function or some activity, I can pull those items out of the queue and process them in order without having to potentially impact the end users. So here's a couple of different types of queues. I need to put a message, the actual order, into a queue, and these are going to be 2 types of message queues we're going to take a look at over these 4 modules. Or once a queue fills up, I need to actually respond to that. So there may be an activity. When there's items in a queue, you need to clear something. So, I need to go off now and, create a thumbnail or maybe do some image classification against that image. So when you take a look at the types of queues, and this is where we're going to take a look at these 4 recordings, we have queues in general. We have 2 types of event queues called event grid and event hubs. We are going to be focusing on the event grid in this recording. We'll have a follow along that will get into event hubs that handle these events at different scales and capabilities. And then we have message-based queues, which will be covered in another set of recordings. So when you compare event grid and event hub, I'm going to do them both now, and you might see this twice if you watch both recordings, because which one do I need where and when? So we're going to see that event grid, they're both event-driven. Now, they're both event-driven, but how they put them in there, one is called streaming, one is going to be more enterprise grade. One's a push, one's a pull, millions of transactions per over the event, and then you have millions of transactions per second. Your ordering of this is not guaranteed, or you're getting guaranteed delivery in a FIFO, first in, first out. So we have these different characteristics of picking one or the other, and I'll try and cover those as I get into the content itself. So let's go back to that now. So understanding the broader picture, queues are a way to decouple in your application development some generating activity from some response to that activity that you're going to generate. Those event-based queues fall into the two categories of event grids, which we're going to cover in this recording. We're going to take a look at the types of events that you work with, things called publishers and subscribers. How can we protect the information that's in there? How do I pull that information out? And that's all going to be done around the configuration of the event grid. So event processing, as I said, it's deeply integrated into the Azure services because a lot of the Azure services, like Azure Storage, we've built these capabilities natively in. So as you create a storage account, I maybe need to be notified of a storage account being created. Once items get put into a storage account, maybe I need to know when new items get added, when items get deleted, when they get moved, copied. All of these activities are all part of an event grid process that you can now subscribe to and be triggering activities based around them. And so this simplifies the event consumption, and lowers the overall cost because it's just a native feature that's been built into the Azure services. Taking a look at what's available, and this is just a sampling, what you see on the far left-hand side of the images, these are called the publishers. And so what you now have is the event sources, and literally everything inside of Azure is something that can generate the discrete activities that whatever that resource is, that they can perform. We then take those and we publish them to the event grid. The event grid then has that information in there. We're going to take a look at the different types of grids and the order in which they come in and how you pull that item out. And then you have the event handlers. That's the back end, or what's sometimes called the subscriber, in a pub sub environment. Now, another value is we can have that pub sub, which is what the most common one that people are used to. I also have what's called an event streaming capability, where I can stream the events into the event hub. And now what I'm going to have is this ordered list of items that are appearing in there, and I can pull them off in that ordered value versus do I just need to know if it's happened? You might want to know if an order's taken place, that somebody could then respond to the order to fulfill the order, but maybe somebody else wants to see, I want to count all the orders that have happened. So I don't have to have the same information. I just need to be triggered and maybe do a count of them. So there's different reasons to work with this, but you can see this full set of event handlers in a pub sub environment that you're working with to put the information into the grid. And this is going to get into the textbook description of all these. The key concepts are the publisher. These become the applications or the activities, the resources inside of, by default, Azure that can then put the events that they have been defined into the event grid itself. The events and the cloud events, as I said, become this wide variety of features that are already predefined from all the Azure services, but you could also potentially publish your own values into the event grid. We have the event sources, the generating activity that is at the source of the resources that are being put into the event grid. We get the topics, which defines the category. Now, you could have a topic that says this was a storage account creation or a storage account item deletion. So you can have these different topics, and then subscribers have the capability to subscribe to a topic that they were working for. I don't care about everything in the grid. I'm looking for this specific topic, and I want to pull those items out so that I can listen for them and be able to work with them. So and then you get the event handlers, and these are going to be where the activity is going to then be passed off to through that subscription. So you're seeing all those pieces come together. Now, when you follow the event grid itself, follows what's called a schema, or a very strict format. You'll see this slightly varies over the next couple of types of queues that we're going to be working with. The data that is stored in the grid follows this very strict pattern. It's not like a message queue in my earlier description where I have an order. An order might have a whole bunch of other information that you can configure what the schema of that's going to be. The event grid has this schema that has these items. What is the topic? What is the subject? What is the event type? What was the event time and ID? Now, there is a small data field there. These are typically around the data information that you're looking for. So I've had these conversations with customers where they'd sit there and go, I could put my, lots of data in there. Go, no, it's a pretty small field. So for example, the event might be a file was created in a storage account. So that's the event. We've got our topic, we've got the subject, we've got the event type, the time that it took place, But now I needed to know, well, what was the file that was created? So it might be the URL to the file or the blob in the store. So I know where it is so that I can say, hey, this file changed. I want to pass that off to a handler that says, go take that information and give that information to, say, to cognitive services or image recognition so that I can now categorize that information based on that new file. And I want to then write that information to a database so that I can categorize that file that's been added to the storage so that if someone's searching for a file that meets that criteria, I can have it then published or found by having that information categorized, sent to a database so that I can query that information. So that's that event-based processing that you might want to take a look at. Here's an example of a storage event that you might want to go through and then look for a storage event and respond to it. This is just some sample code. We're going to be getting into a lab in just a few minutes where you're actually going to get a chance to get some hands-on and deal with these activities specifically. Now, the information that appears in the grid has some durability that you're working with. It's not there forever. There's a value that it sits there for a period of time. We can export that information. So maybe you want it to go to you could take event grid values and export them into another type of queue if you wanted. You could put them into an event hub possibly to have them more durable for you. The event grid is, as I said, usually kind of more immediate over a short term. So we have a retry schedule that comes along with this, a retry policy to say, if I can't deliver an event in the event grid to a subscriber, like when do I retry sending it to them? What is the output batching? Like maybe I don't want to have every single one. Maybe I want to batch a group of them together and then handle them as a collective in the back-end processing that you're going to work with in the event handler. So a couple of different ways to deal with this. There's a feature called dead letter reckoning. You're going to see me talk about this across this several times, that if an event cannot be responded to by a subscriber in a specific period of time, as opposed to just disappearing from the grid, which it could do, you might want to be known that event didn't take place. So it takes it out of the grid and stores it in another location called dead letter reckoning that has it there for a period of time. And what I would encourage you to do is if things start to appear in the dead letter reckoning queue, you might want to be notified because there might be a problem. What's wrong with the subscriber? How come they're not getting these events sent to them? And that would be done by monitoring the dead letter reckoning queue because items are now being stale, being retired from the event grid and put into dead letter reckoning before they're actually lost. So all of these pieces come into play to build an overall solution for your application. As with everything in Azure, we talk about security being a critical part of this. There are some built-in roles that you can use to have people be able to publish information to the grid, people who can subscribe to that information and pull information out of it, modify it because maybe you want it left in there because other people might have subscribed to that information. So there's a series of roles that you might want to allocate to really granularly control, and we've talked about this in other recordings, that you don't want to over provision. Make sure that you use the appropriate role, and the real distinguishing feature here is we often talk about owner, contributor, and reader. A reader, exactly like the name says, can read the object but can't delete it or modify it. A contributor has the ability to do all of the things to the object itself without changing the permission. That's the difference. The difference between a contributor role and an owner role is a contributor can do everything except to change the permissions. An owner role can do everything and change its permissions. And so I often see people will over provision and they'll set it to something like, a subscription owner, where you might not want that high a level of permission. They only need to be a contributor for it. So find the appropriate role for the kind of activity that you need to perform against the grid, as well as the objects in the grid. Are they just needing to be read? Do we need to add to them? Do we need to remove them from the grid? So all those different features that are available for you. We have permissions for the event subscriptions that you're dealing with. As I said, they can be defined to the system topics that you have or custom topics of objects that you might be publishing to the grid itself. There are other ways to handle the information. I mentioned this already. The grid itself is a storage location, but you can now have this go out to logic apps. You can have an event grid connector that's going to connect to it. You can use Azure Automation via workbooks, as well as use Azure Functions in the Event Grid triggering capabilities. And I mentioned something like that. Maybe you have an Azure function that takes that information, sends it off to image recognition. You might have another trigger that says, I'm going to take that information, create a thumbnail with it. So you can have this go to your Event Grid trigger to be able to do that. Now, there's several ways that when you work with these webhooks, that by default, they have a synchronous handshake so that when you make that connection, it'll immediately respond to say as its first activity, it sends a communication to it and expecting a reply to indicate that that connection has been set up. If for whatever reason, maybe you've got a proxy server or something that's stopping that communication in between, that would be considered an asynchronous handshake. So it can't happen at the same time. You're going to have to go in and intervene and look for that validation code to indicate that that process of being able to get the events in the Event Grid process to the other handler that you're working with. I mentioned that you might not want to listen for everything. We have people that might be looking for certain types of activities opposed to all the activities that are being published by the publisher. So the publisher might say, as I said, the storage account is going to publish when the storage account is created, when it's deleted, when the objects are added to the storage account, when they're deleted or moved from, all those different things, when a storage or a blob has been accessed in the storage account. I don't want to listen to all that stuff. So you can actually take a look for the event filtering and look for very specific event types. You can filter based on the subject. Remember the schema of the message itself. There was an event type, there was the subject of the message, and you can also then have some custom advanced filtering that you may want to take a look at to find the specific objects in the Event Grid, because there's a lot of information in there you want to target in for that subscription onto the very specific topics you're looking for or items. So let's go out and actually create one of these and play around with Event Grid.
In this lab, I'm going to create an Azure Event Grid topic and a web app endpoint. Then I'm going to build a .NET console application that sends custom events to the Event Grid topic. Let's get into this. The first thing I'm going to do is instantiate a number of variables that I'll be using in the scripts. I'm going to make sure that the resource provider is registered. Now I'm creating an Event Grid topic. Now I'm going to create a message endpoint. I need this endpoint URL, and I'm going to open that up. So here's that endpoint. You'll see that there's no events on the viewer. Now I'm going to subscribe to a topic. I'm going to create a directory and then switch to it for my application. I'm going to create my new application. I'm now going to add the azure.messaging.eventgrid and the .event.net packages to the project. I'm now going to retrieve the URL and the access keys for the topic. This is going to allow me to begin editing my application. While I echoed out some of that information, I can get the key and the endpoints that I need by coming to the Event Grid topic. You'll see that the endpoint is right here, and under access keys, I've got my 2 keys. Let's go back to the application. So let's run the application now. And we'll go see the event page that we have. We've got our records that have been written. We can take a look at what they are. So that ends the lab. Let's go back to the recording.
Welcome back from the lab. We're going to close out this module with our knowledge check. Question number 1, which event schema property requires a value? Go ahead and pause the recording while you think of your answer. The subject property specifies the publisher defined path to the event subject, and it's required. Question number 2, which Event Grid built-in role is appropriate for managing Event Grid resources? Go ahead and pause the recording. So the Event Grid contributor role has the permissions to manage the resources. Remember, the reader only has the capability to read the objects, but to manage them, you need the Event Grid contributor role. So that's pretty quick. That's module number 1, looking at one of the 4 and realistically 5 types of queues that we have available to us. The event grid is probably the first part of that journey to take a look at activities, looking at event-based activities that might trigger other things that your application might need to respond to. It has some built-in capabilities through that pub sub or a streaming capability for you to now have publishers put information into the grid and then have the appropriate subscribers subscribe to some or all of the different activity that might appear in the grid, and then pass that off to a handler to take that activity and perform some job function or calculations on that activity being triggered. Thank you for joining me in this module on the first step of a queue, and I look forward to seeing you in other recordings.